and hello to everybody, and thank you for having me here today. Before we start and find out who you are, just so you know where I'm coming from, we all come from different cultures and experiences, and that's really important to know our learners, what are their past experiences, what are the contexts that they know. So I've taught a range of grade levels. I've been a specialist teacher in ELA as well. I've held different roles at different PYP schools, and I've been in education for 20 years, but 12 in the PYP. And I've lived in a range of countries as well. India's 7 now in total, but Malawi's probably the least number of years. I was only there 3 years, and I'm from the US. I'm also a NESAC visitor and active in the Pune PYP network. And I hope there's some Pune PYP network people here today. Before I start, the thank you really also goes to the school I work at. A big thank you to all the teachers and leadership at Mahindra International School here in Pune. The classroom examples I'm going to share today are from our great, amazing, talented, and reflective PYP teaching staff who really inspire me every single day. And it's a real pleasure to work with them and to play with all these ideas I'm going to share with you. So thank you to all those teachers, and a big credit to them as I share their examples throughout these slides. Okay, so now you know a little bit about who I am. We're going to go through today's schedule and see what we're going to do today. And then we'll get on to who you are. So first, the chat is going to be really important in this session. I've chosen not to do breakout rooms because there's a lot of us. At first, I thought we'd be 20 people or something, but 465 signed up. That was the list Sheetal sent me. So we're going to use the chat feature a lot today, and Sheetal's going to go ahead and put in the Padlet in the chat. In the Padlet, if you want to have it open or refer to it later, the slides are there already. You already have access to them in that Padlet. All resources shared are there along with a bunch of other resources. There's also in the Padlet a lot of empty spaces, and that's intentional. It's for you to share examples. I'm going to be sharing examples from our school, but I'd love for you to post examples of communication skills, self-management skills, etc. So please use that Padlet and post there actively throughout or also after our session today. Also, please write in the chat whenever you want to react to things. I've been in many webinars since the pandemic started, and sometimes I get the best ideas from the chat. So I do hope you get some good ideas from the presentation I'm going to do, but please share freely in the chat and have that open and be looking and interacting with each other as things come to you. I will prompt you at certain points to write to the chat, but I'd also love it if you just, add your ideas and reactions there as well. We will send you a PDF of the chat. Sheetal's assured me that we'll get that, in text as well, so you can refer back to it. And I'll put that on the Padlet as well. So today on each slide, there's a purple part that's just shown up. And each slide, what I did was I looked at each thing we're going to do today through the lens of the ATL. And that was a really interesting exercise. And I would suggest doing it yourselves as you think of any engagement you planned last week or the week coming up, to really specify what ATL skill you're looking at. I think there's a real difficulty, and we'll explore this. Oftentimes we say, oh yes, I'm using my self-management skills, but that's very broad. And it's true, it is broad, but sometimes it's good to take that magnifying glass and really look specifically and explicitly at what ATL skill we're doing. So for example, the schedule I'm presenting with you today, I'm using my self-management skills, yes, but further I'm using my organizational skills, and I'm using my organizational skills to plan short-term tasks. This isn't a long-term task, but short-term tasks for our hour and a half together today. So I've added this to each slide, and it was a great practice for me as I was presenting or preparing these slides. And I would really suggest that could be a next step for you in your exploration and inquiry into the ATL. So your challenge today is to look at each idea through the ATL if that interests you, so you can kind of monitor your own engagement with the ATL skills today. We're first going to look, this is kind of the order of what we're going to look at today. A little introduction, we'll do a poll in the chat in a minute. 1 to 5, we're going to go through fairly quick. Number 6 is really where the focus will be today, on the implicit and explicit teaching of the ATL. I'm going to share with you some more connections. I'm going to touch on virtual learning. We'll have time to reflect together and hopefully questions and answers in the last 15 minutes. So do be adding those. Sheetal will be collecting those and I'll be addressing those at the end. So that's our schedule today. We have some symbols for today. So on the slide, if you see a link, that means a link is coming in the chat. If you see a chat symbol, that means please go to the chat. I'll prompt you as well. The clipboard will be a poll in the chat. And I'm going to share with you 3 files today. And the file also needs to go, you can check that in the chat. The files are also in the Padlet as well. So the first thing Sheetal, I think, has shared with you, it's hard for me to see from my view, but she's probably shared with you the Padlet, and then she's going to share a PDF of the ATL skills as they are written in the Principles into Practice. Your school may have developed your own, but I'm going to be asking you today to reflect on those, and I thought it's better that you just have a quick reference point. So please do access that PDF that's being shared with you. And it's also on the Padlet as well for your reference. So this is what today's going to look like. And I'm really excited. Let's get started. So the first thing I want to know is, who are we collectively in this group? And we're going to use our research skills. And we're going to gather some data right now. And we're going to use a variety of platforms and formats, which is the chat in Zoom. So right now, I think Sheetal should be getting up the poll, and there are 3 questions. She's put them all up, so that's great. I'm going to move my poll over so I can see as well. So the first question I have, just to kind of get to know who we are, is what grade level do you mainly teach? Are you in the early years, lower primary, upper primary? Where are you located? Are you in Karnataka, somewhere else in India, or outside India? And the last one will be really interesting to see the data. So are you still virtual with your students? Some are in person with you, some are virtual, like a hybrid model, or are all of your students in person with you at school? So if you could click, hopefully you see the poll and you're clicking on it and you're submitting those questions, and then we'll have a little look at the results as they come through. Just give that a minute to come through. I can see there are 300 participants, so Sheetal will just let it. And Sheetal, I might miss seeing the results maybe, so if you can chime in with the results when you get them.
Yeah, we're at 73% who voted, so I'm just waiting to at least reach 85.
Great.
Just another minute longer, and then we can see the results together.
Super. And so something great to do with your students is you can also be predicting what you think the results will be. I feel like we're going to be, I don't know, my prediction I think is lower primary. I think we're mainly in other places in India. And I think a lot of us are still virtual or in the hybrid mode. So that'll be interesting to see. Oh, there we are. And I hope everybody can see that. So yeah, we are mainly, if we put together lower and upper primary, that's most of us. 76% are located somewhere else in India and just 2% outside of India. Wow, 94% are all virtual. That's really interesting. So I'm glad I've included that virtual aspect. I'll try to highlight that as we go through. We are as well. March 16th will mark 1 year in the virtual world. Okay, great job. Thank you for that poll. So before we start, I am a language person. I love language and how it works and the intricacies of it. So a note about language around the ATL. something really interesting a teacher in our school brought to my attention. She said, ATL stands for approaches to learning. And often we see it referred to as the ATLs. I do this all the time. And she said, you know what, Carla, in the Principles into Practice, it's the ATL. And I said, no way. I don't believe you. And she said, absolutely. I mean, I did believe her. And so I went right away, right when she said that, I went to the Principles into Practice and I checked, and here I've pulled some examples. And sure enough, it's the ATL. It's not the ATLs. So I've been trying my best to refer to it as the IB do, as the ATL and not the ATLs. So it's a really interesting language point that you might want to think about. Okay, today we're going to set our learning goals together. And so we're going to use our thinking skills, which I think are metacognition, and we're going to consider skills and strategies for effective learning today. So this was mentioned, goodness, by I think Trevor McKenzie and probably by Tanya, split screen teaching. If this is new to you or you haven't played around with it much, it might be something that you're interested in doing. In the Padlet, there's a whole column dedicated to split screen teaching and learning. So if you have some great examples, please do add to that. If you're new to split screen teaching, this is what it is. It's kind of like having two screens, which is what I've tried to show. And the first one is the content, what we are learning. So that could be art, it could be music, it could be, any of the content that we're learning, which of course in the PYP should be powerful and significant and relevant and authentic. And then on the other side, we're really looking at, today we're going to focus on the skill. Sometimes we could focus on the learner profile. And to think of that in terms of the learning muscle. And this split screen teaching is from Guy Claxon. He talks about building learning power. It's about how we learn. So bringing attention to how we learn, which of course are the skills. And when we identify and make this explicit in our teaching, it really helps us develop a shared language to talk and think about learning. And in this case, the ATL. If we're highlighting to the students, we're learning about, I don't know why I'm choosing music examples, but we're learning about some concept in music, but we're learning this skill. If learners are already seeing this in other parts of the school, they'll be able to make those transdisciplinary connections and that, hey, I used that skill in my homeroom class. So it's a really powerful tool to use, especially if it's used across the school. And it really helps us speak learnish. I think that's from Kath Murdoch. I went to one of her workshops and really we tried playing around with it after that point. So if we look at setting, so the what is on the left, the content is the what, and the learning muscle is the how, okay? So this is my learning goal. So I'm gonna model to you first what mine is. And the content for all of us today is the same. You're not inquiring into, music or other subjects. We are inquiring together today into exploring new ways to approach and teach the ATL, okay, and learn through the ATL. That's what our content is today. And of course, that content could be something different in your class. It would be. And the how today, this is mine. That's the reason it's in blue. My learning muscle skill today, my ATL today, is definitely communication. I'm trying my best to speak and express my ideas clearly and logically in a large group and on Zoom. And I'm also pulling on some ICT skills. This is from the Principles into Practice. I've tried my best to make informed choices about modes of communication based on the audience. So this is my personal learning goal. And you can see maybe that although the class might have the same content, we can differentiate by having students maybe co-construct this. Maybe you could have two that you list here and they could choose one to personalize it. So there are many ways we could even think about this in terms of differentiation or in terms of personalization even, or co-constructing. So this is a really powerful tool that we can use, in many aspects of our teaching. So this is my learning muscle goal for today, not yours, because you won't be expressing your ideas, maybe in the chat, but not the speaking part. So what I'd ask for you to do now is to set your own learning goal. So your content is clear. This session is about the ATL. We're not going to be looking at other things. And I want to know what learning muscle through the ATL will you develop during this session? And so if you want to use that PDF of all the skills, and I think the more specific you can be, the more you'll notice yourself as a learner. So instead of saying in the chat, I'm going to develop my thinking skills, look at the thinking skills and look at the sub skills and the sub skills and really identify one particular thing that you want to hone in on. And please add it to our chat. I'll just give you a minute or so. Oh, I can see the chat. There we go. Okay, I've got my chat finally working on my screen. Great. So I see, research. So think further. What else in research? Let's really delve into those sub skills and those sub skills. What specifically are you going to focus on today? Is it creative thinking? Are you going to be considering new perspectives today? Great. Yeah, so I think as teachers, when we're planning, not to stop at the large goal, the large skill of the 5 categories, but to go deeper and deeper and really clarify that and to really articulate that with our students. So in the learning muscle side, we're going to not just say communication skills. We need to really be specific about that if we have a clear learning intention for that time. Great. Okay, I see acquisition of knowledge. Wonderful. Develop critical thinking. Synthesize and interpret. Super. Really good ideas. Keep them coming, but I'm going to move on, okay? Okay, let me click here. Okay, so we've set our learning goal. And as we do with our learners, we start with a kind of a pre-assessment or a self-assessment. And this is critical for differentiation. It's critical for so many things. So I'm going to have you do a little self-assessment. And this is part of research skills. Again, we're going to gather data and we're going to have a poll with another poll, which Sheetal is going to put over there in your chat. So the first one is, in your teaching, which ATL category, now I'm using the 5 big categories, which of these, you can only choose one, is your strength? You think, I'm really good at teaching and facilitating self-management skills. And the other question is, in your teaching, which ATL category do you want to develop more? Which one do you need more skills? You want to inquire more into, you're more curious about. So those 2 questions, if you could answer those in the poll, and we'll look at those. I have should I give my prediction again? I don't want to influence anybody.
We have about 60% of people polling right now.
Oh, I'm so curious. What could it be?
I'm just going to give it another minute before I share the results.
No problem. What do you think? So right now, hopefully you're using your thinking skills and you're predicting, you're thinking, I wonder what other people also consider their strength. And you may want to pose this or gather this data as a whole staff or in a grade level or in a teaching team to really further make a goal for yourself. This would be a really, if you want to tackle the ATL as a school, you may want to start to focus in on one where you feel you need more work. So this could be a quick and easy poll and data gathering you could do with your students, with teachers. Okay, interesting. You consider communication your strength. I thought teachers would say that because we are communicators. That's great. The lowest we see in the strength is the social and self-management. That's interesting. But the one that we want to develop the most is research, followed closely by thinking. Very interesting. So social and self-management, somewhere in the middle, it looks like, didn't come out very clearly. Very interesting data. And I think if you do this with your learners or your fellow teachers, you have some really interesting data where you can start an inquiry from. Well done. So I've created a self-assessment tool for you to look further at this. And Sheetal in the chat is going to put this file. It's a Word document. It's also in the Padlet. You can access it from there. So I think, and as I said, if you were in the panel this morning, I think reflection is just an essential skill to be an effective inquiry teacher, and an honest reflection, and one that's action-based. So I developed this to help you in that process in terms of the ATL, and thinking more specifically, not too broadly about ATL. So I took these two quotes. Hopefully you can see at the top. Do you see the blue and the green? These are quotes from the Principles into Practice. And it says, it is important to recognize that all members of the learning community continue to develop the ATL and associated subskills throughout their lives. And I love this quote from the Principles into Practice because it really says, it recognizes that we as teachers continue to develop these ATL. We are not the holders of all of this knowledge of the ATL or of anything, as we know. And when I see that learning community, I'm also thinking of our parents. I wonder how they're developing their ATL skills. So in that question, I figured the reflection point is, and in the Word document, there's a drop-down menu, and you can choose one of the sub-skills. Now, you can take this template and you can input your sub-skills, or you don't have to have them all. It's up to you. But what you can think about in this template is, okay, let me choose critical thinking, for example. What is my strength in terms of critical thinking personally? What's my personal next step? So thinking on a professional level, okay, what things do I need to do? And then the last column, which is in the green, is to think about an example that you share with your learners. And this is a quote from the Principles into Practice as well. When appropriate, teachers share their own experience using and practicing a particular skill. So how could we take this personal reflection and put it into a context that we could share with our learners? And I'm sure you've done this in different ways in your class. But if we take this time to reflect and think very specifically, an age-appropriate specific example, of course, depending on what grade level you're teaching, how could you think of a situation that you could actually share your experience with your learners? So this is really a tool for you to use. You can use it in many different ways. And the idea is not to reflect on all of them. I would choose one or two, or maybe even just one, and go through this self-assessment process because it's really important for us as learners to identify what's our strength, what's our next step, and how can I communicate this to learners.
Is this a link on the Padlet, Carla?
The Padlet, this document is in the Padlet, okay. And the document has been shared in the chat. It's a Word document. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to talk briefly about some shifts in the PYP around ATL. So from the program standards and practices from 2014, I was searching through to see, okay, where does it mention the skills, which we called transdisciplinary skills, right? And all I could really find were these two standards and practices. And in the Making It Happen, if you go back, it feels like an old document, but if you go back, which I did, and look at the transdisciplinary skills, it's very short. And it talks a lot about it being an essential element. And there's some good parts in there. But when we shift to our new standards and practices, it really shifts quite dramatically. We, of course, have this model, and I don't know how far your school is into engaging with the new standards and practices. But we have this model over here, and the ATL fall under learning, which is in the center in the blue. And it really explicitly says that IB World Schools develop students ready for further education and life beyond the classroom. So this concept of linking the skills to lifelong learners, it comes under the standard of students as lifelong learners. And then the practices really explicitly mention it. Students actively develop these skills, and the school implements and reviews the development of the IB's approaches to learning. So in that, it's not just saying that you implement them, but you actually review the development of them. So this might be some area that you think your school might need to work on. So it's a big shift. If you can see what was mentioned in 2014 to 2018, there's quite a big shift. And there's a shift in our making the PYP happen to the principles into practice as well. So it's good to think about those shifts. We're a continuum school, and so we think about the ATLs very much in the continuum. And I know that some questions focused on how do you map them across the 3 programs, or 4 if you have CP. Really great question. That could be a whole nother session. You do it carefully with lots of communication, and you don't just have a document, you talk about the document. But this is a really important link that we just shouldn't leave out, especially if you have the MYP and the DP. And if you have something else in the middle years, somehow you want those skills to continue. They shouldn't be dropped out. So hopefully that's a thought that you're using. So now I'm going to get to kind of the heart of what we're going to talk about today. In the Principles into Practice, it talks about the holistic development of the ATL. And it talks about, in the holistic development, it talks about implicit and explicit. And there's a whole section on that. And I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And what I'm doing today is really pulling that apart with some examples. So in here, this is from the Principles into Practice. These are not my own ideas. We use the language, we do these things. I can't list these as, I think, bullet points. It lists these 7 things. That's a lot for me to talk about today. I'm not going to discuss number 2. I'm going to address 1 and then 3 to 7 in the following slides. Okay. So the first one is that the IB says is to use the language of the ATL. So implicit, when we're talking about implicit, it's not like a lesson on this. It's not identified in our planning. This is just ongoing all the time. Implicit means ongoing all the time. So the language of the ATL is embedded in the language that we use in the classroom and in the school. And I spoke this morning, I actually mentioned this book, Choice Words, How Language Affects Children's Learning. It's a really thin book, and the audience is even for parents. So I'd really suggest perhaps reading this book. It's a great, great book about the power of our language. And so, you know, what does this mean? Well, we're going to model the language of thinking. We're going to ask open-ended questions. We're going to use the language of visible thinking routines. We're going to use the language of academic integrity and the language of citation. These are all parts of ATL that go everywhere. We're going to use the ATL language in conversations and discussions with learners and colleagues and with parents, the entire learning community. So in order to use the language of the ATL, you have to be really comfortable with that language. And so if you don't feel comfortable with the language yet, maybe that's the next step for you, is to get more comfortable with that language. And it just should permeate our language. It shouldn't be, it's like the learner profile, as we teach the learner profile holistically. It's just a part of the language we use every day with the kids. We're using open-minded, risk-taker, all these words just naturally, it just comes. And that's the level that we really want to get to. I'm still working on this, that's for sure. And maybe that's, you know, something you might want to look into. So this, you don't have to put it in the chat, but what specific language could I use to support a specific ATL? So if you think of metacognition, for example, what's the best language to use? We shouldn't use too much language. We shouldn't use too little language. What are those choice words? So that's why I love the title of this book. What are those choice words? We only have so much time with kids. We should not waste it with words we don't particularly need. So what are those best words? And I think it's a good practice to think about a subskill. Literally think about that subskill and think, what words would I use to really explain that or embed that in my language? Okay. Another thing that we can think about, the IB says, is to give feedback with the language of the ATL. Okay. So how can you incorporate a particular subskill into your feedback to learners? And again, what words might be most effective? Okay. Now, I hope you can see this, or it's a little bit large on your screen. This is some feedback from teachers at our school on Seesaw, and I've blocked out, of course, the names. Hopefully you can see some of the ATL language here. Maybe you could think of a different way to say it. Our teachers are amazing, but I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. This is one way and some examples. And you might want to think further about looking at some of the feedback you've given, especially the written feedback, and think again, okay, is that the best choice of words? Yeah. The next one, oh, I love this one. Another implicit way to embed the ATL is to highlight it in literature. This is from the Principles into Practice. I'm just pulling it out here for you. So one is we all have, I think, library data systems. In our school, we use Destiny Discover, which is from Follett, but you might have, you know, how you catalog your books. You have some system probably. So this is an image from Destiny Discover. And in Destiny Discover, you can add tags, right, to books. So we've been working on tagging things with the learner profile. But a next step for us is to maybe look at tagging the ATL to the book. So when you're in the data system, you can just search for even a particular subskill, and you would get a bunch of literature that might show up. We know how powerful literature is in primary in particular, and the read alouds we do. That's one idea. So that might be something to discuss with your librarian, or if you are a librarian, this might be an idea for your school to take forward. We've been using Epic. And I'm assuming lots of other schools have been as well, because they're free books. And if you don't know Epic, the link is in the slides, which you can find the PDF on the Padlet, and you can click there. Creating Epic collections around the ATL or searching for skills. So teachers doing this and curating collections around certain skills would be a great idea. And what about learners creating classroom collections? So let's say you're in your class and you have your class library, and maybe in that unit, you're focusing on some skill, and the students, as they're engaging with the class library, they're making connections and creating a class collection around that skill as well. It's another idea. So if you can add to the chat, think of a book that you've read out loud to your learners or that you've assigned recently, and can you think right now with that ATL list in front of you, is there a link? Is there a link beyond just communication, thinking, self-management research? Is there a further link to a subskill? See if you can push your thinking and think about a name of a book and a specific ATL. Kind of a challenge question. And I wonder, when you read that book, how could you highlight that? So to take your thinking further, you have a book, you have an ATL subskill, and how could you bring that out to the learners? Maybe just by talking about it, maybe with the language you use, maybe with an actual engagement, maybe with a reflection. There are many ways you could do it. This is a challenging one. I'm not seeing many answers in the chat. It's not so easy. Oh, great. Thank you. Oh, thanks, Preeti. Great. Oh, wonderful. So this is something I was searching for actually in preparation for this session, and I couldn't find, usually you can find literature linked to the learner profile. I couldn't find great collections out there linked to the ATL. Maybe you have one, and that'd be great if you have one already, if you can add it to the Padlet. I would love for you to do that. Ooh, The Most Magnificent Thing. That's a great one on Epic. Oh, now they're coming. Look, we're creating a list ourselves right now. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to keep moving, but keep adding them. This one's another interesting one, and I think can push your thinking. How do we use the ATL in our learning spaces? So I'm going to give you an example of physical spaces and then one slide of our virtual spaces, because I know we're 94% of us are still all virtual. This is another amazing graphic from the IB in our principles into practice. So using this as kind of the definition or visual definition of our learning spaces. And how did these come to life with the ATL? Where's the intersection between our learning space and the ATL? So here are a few examples from our school. Our early years team, I don't know if any of them are here, they're amazing, and they do wonderful provocations, beautiful provocations. And here's one example, I think from 2 years ago. They have plants out, they were definitely doing a unit on sharing the planet, and they put out a provocation. Which one will you create? So whether we explicitly to the kids link it to the ATL, or we know as a teacher, though, we should know somewhere, yeah, I'm linking it to this. Creative thinking, generating novel ideas. This is one example of a provocation in the class. Here's our mud kitchen outside early years, which they create fabulous drinks and cakes. Anytime you want to go, you have something special on the menu. And this is a really social space, I feel, and great for interpersonal relationships. So if we hone in and decide on that sub-skill, I think it really frames our thinking a little bit better. And it helps us in our observation skills. So if I'm observing in the mud kitchen, or if I'm observing that provocation, I actually have a focus perhaps to my observation. I'm observing other things, but it gives me that focus. The last one is, you have anchor charts, I'm assuming when we're in physical school around the class with co-constructed ideas. This is what to do when we're angry or upset. And so the idea here is that these anchor charts share an intersection in our learning space with an ATL. So this one is around managing anger. But the concept is using anchor charts around the classroom. And how could we further link them, or maybe explicitly link them to the ATL? So here are some virtual examples. I'm just giving the examples. We're in Seesaw and Google Classroom. So in Seesaw, we organize our folders in a certain way throughout the school, and the kids didn't decide that, we decided that. So we're kind of teaching this skill that we have to keep an organized and logical system to document our learning. So how do these folders help us? Do we explore that with the kids? Why things are set up the way they are? In the classroom, we probably do more of a co-constructed learning environment, but in virtual world, we set up some of these organizational systems. Otherwise, it might be quite chaotic. And we intentionally give these little emojis, I hope you can see, next to visual arts and music to help them identify. That's another way to help us. Okay, so what's that organizational system? And are we making it explicit to the learners? In Google Classroom, we played around with lots of different organizational ways. And this is in the classwork section. And it helps us use technology effectively and productively. So exploring those systems in our virtual spaces as well. So those are some different examples. Okay, from the principles into practice in implicit, how do we implicitly embed these into our teaching? It's around the essential agreements. How does your essential agreement link with the ATL? Do you make it explicit? Maybe it's implicit. Maybe it's in the language that you use when you create them. And so here are a few examples. This is from early years. They were drawing their illustration of listening and speaking to others helps you learn. This is one of their agreements, and they were illustrating it, and they were building that consensus. Here is an example from our grade 3s. They came up with, and our essential agreements, I hope yours too, are co-constructed with the learners. This is very funny. The grade 3s were co-constructing responsibilities in Google Meets. So there's the side chat checker. I think that's an interesting one, but really going with their language, right? But how do these link? They definitely link to the ATL. And maybe it's okay, we don't have to link everything to the ATL explicitly to the students, but knowing as a teacher what those links are. And at times, bringing that in our language. So as we're co-constructing this, our teachers are bringing that language into that conversation. It doesn't always need to be explicitly linked. Like I'm linking it here, right? I'm putting the ATL above it. We don't necessarily need to do that, maybe sometimes. But how do we embed that language when we're making these essential agreements with our learners? Here's some more examples. This was created for Google Meets. We use Google Meets. The students, it looks really lovely, but the students came up with these. We wake up early. We're not in our pajamas. I don't know if that one's dress appropriately. That's there. There we go. And here's another example from grade 5 of their Google Meet essential agreements as well. And these were co-constructed. So the bigger question here is, how can we link these essential agreements with the ATL? And how do we do that? What's the best way to do that? Okay. So that's another implicit idea. Are we done with implicit? No. Routines. So we all have routines. So how do the routines in your lessons link to the ATL? So in virtual learning, this was a challenge for us. One way, there are many routines that we have. One way, and look, this links really strongly with the essential agreements you just saw. I mean, they're very close together. So these could overlap. We created this virtual learning schedule for the day. Our students are mainly asynchronous, and there's a bit of synchronicity there. And so this is a Google Sheet, and it has the day, and we put all this in, and the kids, it's drop-down menus, and they decide what they're gonna do from 8 to 8:30, and 8:30 to 9, and 9 to 9:30. And so they have 2 to 3 Google Meets in a day. So they put in those Google Meet. You should see like a little phone that says Google Meet. So they know their Google Meet is on those days, or on those times, sorry. And then, so it's a drop-down menu, and they schedule their day, and then they tick when they're done. And then we don't have homework, but we have home learning, which is reading. And so on the bottom, you see it says home learning, and that's where they record what book they read and select the genre. It's mainly drop-down menus and tick marks to help them organize themselves in virtual learning and help with that routine. So how does this link to ATL? Do we make it explicit? Do we just use the language of the ATL? Do the students realize this is to manage their learning? It's interesting. Not one way is not right over another. It's just good to think about as we're planning these. Do you have a routine in your class? And if so, how does it link to the ATL subskill? Could you make it more explicit? Does it need to be more explicit? So if you'd like to, similar to the books, share a quick routine. So ours would be virtual learning schedule and which ATL it links to. If you have a routine that you'd like to share, either in the chat or on the Padlet as well, feel free to do that. Just give you a minute to think about that. Okay. Great. Great. I'm seeing a few ideas, and I'll. Great. Wonderful. Excellent. Okay, we're going to now switch over to the explicit. So those examples were more in our planning and how this is just coming through the things that we normally do in our day. And now we're going to shift to explicit teaching of the ATL and all the ways that we do it much more explicitly. And these are coming again from the Principles into Practice. These are not my own ideas here. Sorry, this list. These are written in the Principles into Practice. We're just going to look at them and pick them apart a little bit further and give some examples. I'm going to look at number 1 to 3 and 5 and 6. I'm not particularly going to address number 4, just due to time and the platform as well. Okay. So one explicit way we can do this and teach ATL is to co-construct ATL goals. And I'm sure some of you have done this already. One way to do it in the early years, and I've had to blank out the students' pictures, But our EY3s, which are 5 to 6 year olds, they co-constructed self-management skills. This is when we were together in person. And so we've been playing around with kind of in the early years, and in this class in particular, throwing the category out there like self-management and seeing what the kids think that is. Because then we take their language and their understanding, and it's immediately differentiated for them. And so this was the EY3 co-constructed idea of what self-management skills are. And they took a picture. I know I've blanked out the pictures, but we took a picture of each, of that, of course, because they're visual, they're not all of them are reading yet, so that they would construct it. That means so much more to them than having self-management skills on the wall. And I think we've all seen this, learner profiles on the wall or the skills are on the wall. But if the kids have not had, that ownership of creating it together, it doesn't really have an impact. So when we do that co-construction, when we use their language, and when we put it up in the classroom, it makes a lot more sense to them. And maybe the teacher would then, think some of these are not so relevant to self-management, maybe they are, and then maybe focus in on a few. And then students, after you've co-constructed, maybe they want to choose one that they want to focus on. Once we've co-constructed and they know the language and it's in their language, we can easily personalize. So choose two you're really good at, choose one you want to work on, right? And that reflection process gets a really easier. I can see you're looking for a virtual scenario. This is really easy in a virtual world. You get them on a meet, you talk about what self-management skills you're using. With the younger learners, you can ask them to take a picture of them doing self-management skills. I have an example a bit later on of something our grade 2 teacher did. You do a similar format. They can take a picture of themselves doing it, and then you can create different virtual ways of doing that. Okay, another way is we identify a specific ATL for a unit of inquiry. And in the panel discussion this morning, Chris kind of touched on this point, that we identify it in the planner and then do we really do it? Yeah. Sorry?
Sorry, requesting the participants, requesting everyone to please mute themselves. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Carla.
That's all right. So there's this balance, I think, between specifically identifying one and keeping it in the context of all. So just think about that. We're trying to explicitly teach, but it's in the context of all. So I'm going to try and give you an example of what I'm talking about. So one approach, which is an approach that we definitely use in our school, is in your POI in a grade level for each unit. Let's say there are 6 units. We could be in a grade 1 to 5. There are 6 units in the year, and we choose one category to focus on and limited sub-skills that link with a specific learner profile aspect. Okay, I'm going to give you a visual. Stay with me. So in one unit, we choose self-management skills, for example. And then in the self-management, we identify a limited number of sub-skills that then link with a learner profile aspect. And we explicitly will teach that. Now, it doesn't mean we're not touching on the other ATL implicitly, which all those examples I gave before, it's in our language, we're making links to ATL, but both can happen at the same time, in my view. So our POI, this is a section of one part of our POI. We do it in Excel because it has drop-down menus. So in who we are, for example, we've identified aspects of the learner profile attributes. And what we've done is we've actually taken the learner profile sentences. There are multiple sentences to each learner profile attribute in the definition of each learner profile attribute. And we actually select the exact sentence we're going to focus on in that definition to further narrow it. And we try to link it to an approach to learning. So for example, where we are in place and time, we're looking at research. So we focus on research skills and the sub-skill particularly of information literacy. Okay, and this means we're explicitly going to teach this. There will be learning engagements around this in this unit. but we will be referencing the other ATL more implicitly. So it's this balance between explicit, this is where we're identifying it, and implicitly teaching. Do you see? I'm hoping you see how the two can go hand in hand. If we don't use this specific language and have specific engagements, you end up just broadly saying, oh, we're doing communication skills. Oh, we're doing self-management skills. So I'm of the belief that they both need to happen, you know, in a strategic way. So there's an example. Sorry, I forgot I had the slide. The ATL subskill defined becomes the defining integration point as well. So some of our specialists, I know there were questions around single subject teachers, and I know integration and transdisciplinary learning is always a big question. So sometimes, often, that subskill ATL focus becomes that integration point for other subjects, which then strengthens our transdisciplinary learning. So for example, that research information literacy, if I use that example, our librarian has sessions called information literacy, and she may focus in on that. That's her integration point. It's not through the central idea particularly. The content will be the unit, but that's her real integration point. And we've been playing around with having integration through ATL. The ATL is transdisciplinary. So that seems like the most logical place to have transdisciplinary learning because it's through these skills which are trans. Okay, there's another level we can explicitly do it, is we can look at our scope and sequence documents. And of course, we have the flexibility within the PYP framework to really, play with this, which is fabulous. And we can inquire into what really works well. This is PSE. Our counselor has been doing some great work with our teachers in collaboration with them. And taking the ATL, so you see the ATL at the top. Sorry, I'm looking at this screen because it's just too small on my presentation screen. So for example, that ATL at the top says social, and then emotional intelligence. That's the subskill. The objective is taken from his standards, which we use ISCA standards, okay, which is an external thing outside the scope and sequence. And the outcome is combining the conceptual understanding and the learning outcome from the PSPE scope and sequence. So we've lined up the ATL and specific. We're not just saying social skills, right? We're going to clarify that further. We're taking an outcome from outside and we're putting in that scope and sequence work there, the conceptual understanding and the learning outcome. So it all lines up together. And then that's integrated through a unit in the POI. Another example, this is part of our digital literacy scope and sequence. So in our scope and sequence document, we're defining that ATL. So hopefully you can see that there's an objective. This is for EY1 to P1, it's a continuum, and that ATL is explicitly mentioned. And our information literacy scope and sequence as well, we have that ATL column. And we're going further. We could go further, you could say, but we've gone beyond just that larger category and gone a bit further. So we can explicitly do this in our scope and sequence documents. And I'm sure you guys have great examples. So if you have them, please do share them in the Padlet as well. Okay, another way that we explicitly do this is we design specific learning engagements, right? So getting down to that subskill, this requires a lot of creative thinking and like taking an old engagement and tweaking it to bring in the ATL there, okay? So here's one really obvious example. This is in virtual learning. This is from our librarian. This is about the students had to reflect and record their thinking around research. And so it really was, they've been going through the research process. How do you research, et cetera? And they had to write down their answers. This was in Seesaw in a note that a student typed. And this is an amazing piece of work. I was amazed to see this in Seesaw. So this is a very specific engagement. Tell me the research process. We've just been doing it. What have you learned? Yeah, and it's very clear this student has learned a lot about research. So this is a pretty specific learning engagement around a pretty specific ATL. There's some other examples. Our P1s were looking, they had a unit on who we are and conflict situations. It's about relationships and the choices we make, things like this. They were given conflict situations. And And this was specifically linked to these subskills, which you can see there. And they had to reenact the conflict situation with their toys. And this was a video on Seesaw. And they had to pretty explicitly do that. And you can see her instructions there, and it's highlighting some of the ATL. Okay. So what else can we do? We can, the IB says that we can reflect on aspects of the ATL, and reflection is ongoing. It's been removed as a key concept, as you know. So this is another way we could do it. This is a grade 2 example, and they were actually exploring the transdisciplinary theme, how we organize ourselves. And this is a Seesaw activity. So it says, what are the 3 ways in which you organize yourself or your day? Look around your house and take a picture of something that's organized. That'll give you a great idea as to what kids think is organized and what's not. And then going further to reflect, the reflection point to me is, why is it important to organize ourselves? And they had to think about that. This is a student's piece of work. Then they had to organize this unorganized desk and arrange it. So pick up those things and arrange it, and then explain their system for why it looks organized. So an engagement like this is really, now this is a virtual engagement, but an engagement like this is really going to give you an insight. It's reflection, it's a pre-assessment, it's many things in one, which are many of our engagements. So I thought that was, one great example. I'm sure you have other examples. So please do put them over in the Padlet if you have images like this or want to share. That's great. Here are some more. This is a co-constructed reflection. I hope it's large enough for you to see. I keep my, there are ATL everywhere in these statements. Hopefully you can see that. It talks about mindset, about monitoring their learning, and then just using the simple yes, no, somewhat. And this was co-constructed. So a lot of these examples, it's not, to just lift them and copy these sentences isn't going to be effective. It's effective to create these sentences with your students and to see how they reflect best. That's one example. P4s, we have Passion Project. And so the Passion Project, which is a personal inquiry, we give it some structure. So in that, they formally have to specify the skill that they used, and then the reason or the evidence. I heard Tanya talking earlier. It's not just okay to say, yes, I use my communication skills. Well, where's that evidence? And taking that further. So that's an example. Okay. And the monitoring, the development of the ATL is another key thing we can do explicitly. And this really, I saw Tanya touched on this. This is so important, and this could be a next step for you. So the gradual release, if you don't know the concept of gradual release of responsibility or gradual increase of independence, these are things that you definitely must Google and research, because these are the ways in which we can monitor, and we also teach the ATL and model it as well. I've seen lots of great work on using solo models to develop, co-construct, and monitor the development of ATL. There's a great, I think, Toddle resource that Cindy Blackburn has produced that you can find on their website. I think it's also linked in the Padlet. But I think, in my opinion, to monitor the development, identifying that specific ATL and write it as a learning goal, co-constructed with the students, and then be able to reflect, assess, you're co-constructing that, maybe a checklist, maybe through goal setting. So all these tools we have with us, but it's just applying these tools to the ATL. Yeah. So how do we assess ATL? I think in virtual learning, it's the same. I don't think it changes much. I think we do a lot more self-assessment. So you can co-construct with the kids in a Meet, and then it goes up there. They self-assess on a Google form or whatever technology you're using. I think we have the tools where they can self-assess. And I think it's through that self-assessment and that strategically making engagements. The example of the organizing, I think, is an excellent example of that. How we design those questions and the engagement will really help you figure that out. So these are just, the models, which I think most of you have seen, maybe a different way of looking at it. We tend to see the gradual release of responsibility from the teacher perspective of I do, we do, you do it together, and then you do it by yourself, and that scaffolding goes down. But it's really interesting to think from the learner perspective, and many of the models show the learner perspective as well. I observe, I copy, I do, I teach. What I wanted to add here is that green word. So I observe, I think an important change we need to make in our language is I don't know how to do this yet. And we've been working with our students a lot on this word yet, because when you add that word yet, it suggests that you will get it, which they will, of course. So yeah, I don't know it can feel very disempowering. But when we add that word yet, it shows possibility, it shows hope, it shows that I'm going to learn this. So you can be considering in your language adding that word yet to many things that you say to students. And I think this is a helpful model. I don't think we always need to start with I observe. From the student's point of view, I think it's really helpful to throw them in the deep end sometimes, especially when we know our learners. They don't always need to observe first. They might have skills that we don't know they have. So these are some ideas around monitoring that development. And I think it's just through that continuous assessment. I think checklists are really easy for kids, goal setting, personalized goal setting, etc. Okay, so there's another document. So I created 2 reflection documents for you. The first one that was shared was a self-assessment, like me as a learner and how comfortable am I with the ATL, my personal ATL development. And now I've just taken these ideas I've shared with you from implicit and explicit, and I've put them into a reflection document, okay? So it's a Word document, and you can choose one of the sub-skills, and you can modify this if you'd like to suit your own sub-skills. And I've just listed these categories we've just gone through to help you think through a particular sub-skill. So here, this slide is showing it a little bit clearer. These are the questions in that document and in the implicit and the explicit. So let's say you choose a sub-skill of creative thinking. I'm just coming up with that one, thinking skills, creative thinking. So in that tool, you can go through and reflect on all the ways that creative thinking can be implicitly embedded as well as explicitly taught. Okay, so just to take you through an example, if you choose creative thinking, what specific language could I use to support creative thinking, right? What are the words you're going to use? What are the ways I could model creative thinking in my day-to-day teaching and interactions? How can I incorporate creative thinking into my feedback? What words might be most effective? I love this next one. What books could I read to or make available to learners that draw their attention to creative thinking? In what ways could I do that? Are there essential agreements or classroom routines that link to creative thinking? And how does my learning space support creative thinking? So I think that if you go through with just one sub-skill, all the implicit and explicit questions here in this kind of reflection, it's going to give you a really deep dive into that sub-skill. And if you've identified that sub-skill in a unit that you really want to look at, I think it's going to give you a lot of ideas to move forward with. So again, these are all aspects identified in the principles into practice. We're just pulling them apart a bit more and giving you a tool to reflect on in your own practice to move you forward. Okay. So that was the main part, was the examples around implicit and explicit. And again, please share examples on the Padlet. I mean, these are just some. I'm sure you have amazing examples. And if people add their own examples, we can really benefit from different perspectives. So I want to give you a few other ideas to push your thinking with the ATL. And I want to think about how it's connected to the learner profile. So I spoke earlier about how we link the ATL to the learner profile in our POI, okay, explicitly. Now, I love this new graphic from the IB for the learner profile. Not only does it have the learner profile, but it has these verbs in the middle and things we do with the learner profile. We demonstrate it, we value it, we appreciate it, we celebrate it, and we develop it. So how I want you to think about the learner profile and the approaches to learning. And how do these support each other? Implicitly or explicitly? How do they connect? Is there a connection? Where are the connections? Can we make it more explicit? How many connections can we make? How are they linked together? Are some linked more than others? Are there some natural links? And what about the ones that don't seem to be linked? I feel like, thinking and knowledgeable is, okay, fine. That's a very obvious link. But where are the not so obvious ways, right? How else could they link? Yeah. And how do these strengthen each other? How can we leverage one with the other? Is another question I have. I'm sharing these next two slides with you because these are things I'm thinking about and I'm wondering, and questions I don't really have the answers to yet. I have ideas, but I think this provides a really rich discussion, a reflection point first for yourself, and then reflections with your team or with your colleagues as well. And do we need to make these connections explicit to our learners? How do we? I think we do already. Could we do it more? And in what ways could we do it? So there's a I guess my never-ending question is, when do we let it be and say, yes, they just interconnect? And when do we make it explicit? How do we do it implicitly? And what strategic ways do we make it explicit? Because I think if we don't make it explicit sometimes to our learners, then that learning isn't going forward. If we know it, but they don't know it, sometimes we need to make it connected for them or bring their attention to it in different ways. Another one is, the agency, which obviously it's been talked a lot about. And in the principles into practice, it says the aim of the ATL is to support student agency in the development of cognitive and metacognitive skills. So the IB very much says in the principles into practice that the aim of this is to support that. So maybe just a thinking point, how do the approaches to learning support agency? How does it connect? How does it link? And how does it strengthen specifically? So not just saying, communication skills support it, but specifically, how does it support it? I think the more specific we can go in our thinking really makes us consider it at a very deep level. And the last one, the one I'm most interested in, and I'm wondering the most about, which I really want to explore more, is how does it connect to action? And how can we leverage the ATL into more student-initiated action, perhaps? And maybe your school has done thinking around this. So my bigger question, I've added this graphic at the top because I want to think, my wondering, the one I'm most interested in is, how do approaches lead to, quite explicitly, student-initiated and student-led action? So I've given you the action graphic from the IB, but I'm kind of thinking of the one that's in the lower right or the southeast corner. Which one, how can that or which ATL really lead us to that student-initiated and student-led action? Because that's where we really want to get to. So again, thinking how this supports action specifically, how does it connect specifically, how does it link specifically, and how does it strengthen action? So as we further strengthen our teaching of the approaches to learning, does that result in enhanced action in the school? Would be really an interesting research project to look at. So again, I don't have the answers to all these connection slides, but I think it's really important to sit back and think about how all the aspects of our PYP framework, which is so powerful, how are they linked? How can we make these connections stronger and more explicit and implicit? This concept of implicit, explicit, and linking. I think it's really important. I'm just checking the time.
Yeah, I was just going to tell you we have about 20 minutes more.
Perfect. I think we'll have times for question and answer. So there were a lot of questions around virtual learning. And so I wanted to address that kind of in this slide. So the ATL focus has changed in units. And I think first, I heard Tanya say this earlier, it's okay, no problem. So is it the same, you know, when you think of those broadly of the 5 categories, how did it shift? How did the ATL focus shift in this year? And I'm going to call it a year because it will be a year here and definitely in Maharashtra. We're not going back before the 16th. So for us, when I reflect on this, thinking, yeah, okay, I think it stayed the same or lessened. Research, communication, okay, maybe. To me, the 2 big ones that have been enhanced in virtual learning, and I think rightly so, I think they're ones that we didn't pay as much attention to before, are the self-management and the social skills, from my perspective. And I'm sure teachers in my school have a different perspective. This is absolutely my perspective. So in the self-management realm, when we moved to virtual learning, my goodness, the students needed to manage so much. There's so many skills under, so the sub-skills there are the categories are organization and states of mind. So in organization, I mean, they're missing the structure of school with us physically in that room and the teacher kind of directing the day. And they had an opportunity, you know, it was maybe too much freedom perhaps, but they really had to pull on those organizational skills. And I think we saw they struggled with it to a large extent. And that's influenced by many other factors. We're in a pandemic, you know, there's a lot of other stuff going on. So we tried to support it with some tools. You saw the virtual learning schedule, and our teachers have, some use that schedule, some use other ways they've constructed with their learners that work better. We've looked at the structure that we've implemented of Google Classroom and Seesaw. We gave them, I think, amazing thing our school did is if they were in Pune, the school provided stationery that they could come and pick up from school. And that gave them, that helped their social skills as well, have that connection to school. That was from our principal. She did an amazing job with that. They could take their Chromebook and iPad from school. We're one-to-one iPad and Chromebooks. So they could take their device from school. That helped with the organization. But I think we've really worked with the kids with what organizational structure works for you. We are mainly asynchronous. And so they have a lot of time in their day to organize their day. So putting in structures to help them organize their day and develop those self-management skills. States of mind is a huge one. I mean, the states of mind, we're all in a different state of mind in the pandemic. And so that I think we really saw our learners, you know, struggle with, we were struggling with as well, and going through waves and shifts. We've noticed a recent shift, you know, in Maharashtra, at least the grade 5 to 12 could go back to school. And then we're back to 3 weeks, nobody can go to school. So again, it kind of went, oh, you know, and so what do we do about that? We go to states of mind in the ATL, that's my answer. Drop it, drop whatever other skill you're looking at and you go there. And I think the sub-skills under states of mind and those outcomes there are just hugely important at this time. And, you know, we've had daily, you know, I saw somebody put mandala, something, yeah, brain gym, all of these things. I think we're just the most creative teachers ever because we're always like, okay, what else can we do? What else can we do? But I think dropping other things. So in the POI, let's say a grade level said we're going to do research skills and we have these lofty goals. We're going to look at this. And should we drop it? Yes. Yeah, let's change it. Not a problem. What do our learners need? And it's part of putting them at the center. So I guess my point at the top is if your ATL focus change, it's okay. And self-management skills are so important in our daily lives, as we know. Also, sorry, under states of mind, I wanted to mention that virtual meets are fun. So even though our learners have virtual meets in the day, there's been a real effort to have fun. They're not live teaching, really. They have, you know, fun engagements. They're playing Kahoots. they're connecting socially, they're showing their dogs and their cats. And, that is a way to address that as well. And the social, so by the plus, I mean the social interactions went down because we were virtual, but then, so that means we need to have an increased focus on that, right? And so we really needed to look at that. Sorry, that slide is not showing as it should be. I apologize for that. It's just a repeat. So I'll correct that and put that back up. So in the social aspect, really focusing that virtual meets are fun. How can we get them to be more social? And all of those kinds of things, which I'm sure you struggled with as well. So what I'd like you to do now is go back to the start where you identified your learning muscle or the how of what you were going to do today. Hopefully you noted it down. And I wonder, how did you work on that? So go back to that specific subskill and think, did you focus on that throughout the whole time? Were you able to develop that? Did you use that skill? Maybe you didn't. Maybe now that you reflect, you used a different skill or subskill. That's okay. But then, in split screen teaching, we want to introduce that at the start and then always come back to it at the end and say, okay, how did we do? What did you do in that process? So I'm trying to think of one I saw in the chat that was mentioned. If you thought about, creative thinking, did you work on that today? Did you develop it? And not just that, how? Where's the evidence? What exactly did you do in that skill as you explored this content with me today? Okay, so the split screen teaching is really great, but we always need to come back to it and bring attention back to it and reflect on that and come back. So, these sessions are great, and I go to a lot of sessions as well, and you get so many ideas. And I've gotten so much ideas putting this presentation together for you today. So I'd love for you to just think back and take a minute or two and think, okay, I have all these ideas. There's this Padlet here. There were a few, reflection templates that I shared. What are you going to do? Just choose one or two things. There's so many things that were mentioned here, but what are one or two concrete things that you can do in the next 7 days? Set a time frame for yourself, okay? I can see people. I'm seeing the last one. Someone loves the choice words, okay? Maybe you want to explore that book. I saw someone, I think, said they bought that book. Okay, so in the next 7 days, it's going to come after 4 days, and I'm going to read that by this date. So I'd love for you to right now set a goal for yourself. And of all the ideas, what excites you the most? What are you most passionate about? What sparked your interest? Because we are also inquirers. And I know if I identify something that I just have to do, it's not going to be that great. So identify one or two things, small things, not big things. You're not going to redo the whole POI. What are you going to do in the next 7 days? Be specific, write it down, and commit. Yeah, and try to put it into practice next week. Something small. Maybe it's just changing your language that much. That's great. That's a start. Okay. Excellent. Here are some of my works cited. And I think we have time, hopefully, for some questions and answers. It looks like about 10 minutes from my clock.
Yes.
And I would love to answer some of your questions. I'm going to stop sharing, I think, so maybe I can see you all a little bit better. I'm going to stop share and come out of that mode. Okay. Anything, Shita, that really spoke to you?
Yes, thank you so much, Carla. It was a really, really interesting session, and it was so nice to see so many people so interactive on the chat. I was just so thank you all so much for being such an interactive audience, even on such a large platform, considering we had almost 400 participants. I have a few questions that I saw on the chat, so I'm just going to ask you those first. The first one was, so the ATL skills that are identified in the unit that goes for, which is used for like the transdisciplinary transdisciplinary learning. Is that also the ATLs that specialists can use, or should they be choosing a different ATL based on what they're focusing on?
It depends, and you probably won't like that answer, but it really depends. I think the ATL is a really interesting integration point because they cross subjects. So I think if you can be intentional about that and try it out for a unit, you don't have to commit to every single unit. It's an interesting integration point and something we've been playing with a lot more. So no, there's no rules. And the rule book, I guess, is the principles into practice, but it doesn't say that. So the great thing about our rule book is it is open to flexibility with our context, and in my view, it encourages us to play. And so I think that's really important. So it's not probably the answer you wanted to hear. Try it. What's the worst that can happen? It doesn't go well. I don't know. Somebody gets upset. It's okay.
Yeah, we can be a little bit of risk takers with trying out the different ATLs. Another question was, how do we use ATLs when it comes to assessment? How do we actually assess an ATL, or how do we use it in the assessment?
I think the best way is to take all your tools, which you have, which are rubrics and checklists and solo and whatever tool you're most comfortable with. This is the easiest way I could say as a starting point. Take that tool, talk to your learners about the skill, co-construct what do they think it is, what does success look like, you co-construct it, and they self-assess and you assess them based on that co-constructed criteria. To me, that's the easiest way. And do one, don't create this long assessment, right? Just focus on one, co-construct it, and I think they self-assess and you assess, especially in virtual learning because you're not there observing everything. Most of our kids are pretty principled. Especially when you say, we do a lot of reflections with them at the end of the piece of the work. It's like, I did it by myself. I got some help from my parents, or I didn't get any help. So I think, in talking to parents, we've had sessions with parents to say, we need you to be principled. We are not assessing you. We are not interested in that you can do division, in grade 1. Clearly you cannot. So I think it's an ongoing process in virtual learning in that aspect, but I think that's the simplest way I can say it. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question. Any one example of an ATL-based activity for grade 1 and 2 children?
So the one that I shared with the toys, that was a grade 1. I think any, engagement can, if you take your favorite engagement, maybe you can look at it this way, whoever wrote that question, or you guys out there listening, take your favorite engagement and how could I further tweak it so that the ATL is more apparent. So look at your menu of the ATL, whatever your menu is, whether it's the IB or your own school, and just see, okay, put the engagement here, put the ATL here, and see, is there one connection I can make, and how do I tweak it to further bring that to the surface or make it more explicit? That's one way I can think. A specific skill, I think you can take most engagements and find that ATL link. So I would suggest, if that's a challenge, take it to your team, talk about it, and take it to your coordinator. Put your coordinator on the spot and talk about it with your coordinator as well. Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah, since we have a few teachers from the early years as well, they want to know any ideas to tap into self-management skills for early years.
Oh, this is great. These are life skills. So coming up, our early years team have done a lot of work with parents in virtual learning. And I don't know if you're asking in virtual or in person, but it's the same. It's those life skills. So we focused on in virtual learning, do I sit independently at the Google Meet, without someone, being right there, and really just brainstorming with them. So what are you doing? What could you do by yourself? What do your parents do? And what could you do by yourself? We've also provided lists of those skills to parents to say, don't do that. They need to be able to tidy up after themselves. We work on that so hard in school. So tidy up by themselves. I think and I don't know how to say her name, Sonia Tadameyer. It's in the thing. She has a beautiful ATL, like a little image in a very simple sentence. It's in the Padlet. And I would explore her resources around that. I know our teachers, our early years teachers have used those explicitly. So I would, again, though, I co-construct it with them. And it's just, what do you do every day by yourself? And in a positive way, what can I do by myself? And what can I not do yet, that I want to do by myself, that I see maybe the older kids doing. But in the home and virtual learning, I'd very much put it in the home, about tidying up, helping clean clear the table, do all that kind of work. They should be maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm a radical mom. I have a child as well, sweeping their room, using the vacuum cleaner, fold the clothes, even if someone has to fold them again, it's all right. They can have one attempt at folding the clothes. So we have a great opportunity to really leverage those self-management skills when they're at home, and also to reach out to parents. I know our EY1 teacher stays on with the parents in the Google Meet and kind of coaches them slowly every day through a few key things that they could be working on, because it doesn't come naturally to some parents. There's some ideas.
Those were some really, really lovely ideas of how to focus on self-management in daily routines, and something that not just the teachers but the parents can take forward at home too through household chores. Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. One of the participants was asking, could you tell us a little bit about the solo taxonomy for assessing an inquiry process?
Sure. There's so many great examples out there. So Michael Hughes has done a lot of work, continues to do work. I know he was at SACEN, but a lot of those are linked on the Padlet. So really taking apart that structure of I'm observing, I can do together, the gradual release of responsibility. So using that model, Toddle has put together a few that are around solo taxonomy. So again, it's just going from, I can do this, I can make connections, and I can transfer it. I mean, that's the basic concept of solo. So just taking, again, don't make it too complicated. Take one sub-skill, even like tidying up my room if you want to. And so I can tidy up my room. I don't know, I can connect it to other things. I can tidy up my room and somewhere else. And I could teach you in my EY Meet how to tidy up a room, like what are the key aspects to it, and teach somebody else. So I think it's taking that framework and just simplifying it to a very small level. The Toddle examples are great. Michael Hughes has some really great examples. So I would really look to those as some inspiration, but again, putting it in your context. So again, using those as inspiration, and that's why I put those on the Padlet, because those are some things that have provoked my thinking, and then putting it in your context and making it with the kids in their language is really important, especially in the early years.
All right. Thank you so much. That was very, very insightful. Do we have time for one more question?
Okay.
Okay. The last question. How do we create a rubric for ATL skills across grades?
Ooh, collaboration. So yes, through collaboration. I mean, that's a effort that a lot of schools are going through. We're going through that at the moment, working with MYP and DP. We just had our visit, and that's something we've identified in our own action plan is something that we need to further develop. So I would say take that process slow. Collaboration is obviously key. Take it slow, put it in a document, but you have to live the document. So those conversations in that collaboration, it's easy. I could produce a document tomorrow with all the words and send it as a PDF, and everybody's going to do that. That doesn't, we have to live the documents. So I think that process of identifying a timeline, who's going to be involved, and those conversations are what's going to embed that throughout your school. And so to have a process with everybody involved, vertically, single subject specialists, and to develop that. There's just a few examples. I feel this is something many schools struggle with. There's a few examples. If you have something you've played with, please put it on the Padlet. I put a section for continuum, but it has to be a collaborative process that you live. It's my best.
All right. Thank you so much, Carla. For everyone who is still here, I've shared the Padlet link once again. That has a copy of the presentation. It has all the resources, and it does have, like Carla said, there is a column for the continuum as well. So if there are any ideas that anyone has, I'm sure you can put it up on the Padlet even after this session. Apologies for the few technical glitches in the beginning, but I think the session went off really smoothly. Thank you so much, Carla, for being here with us. Thank you all, and we will see you in the ending. There's another vote of thanks session, so we'll see you then. Thank you
Great.
all so much.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to emphasize, I see over 300 people here. That's amazing. If we all add one thing to the Padlet, even one small idea, can you imagine? I saw somebody say, how long will it be open? I'll just keep it open. It's open for life. However long Padlet exists, it will be open. So if everyone adds one small example, even if you feel it's just such a small example, it can really serve as inspiration for somebody else and inspire them to do something. So please do add something small by the end of today or next week, whenever, but please do add things. That would be great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.